Welcome to our weekly livestock review. I'm Brownfield news anchor reporter Meghan Grebner. With us again this week is Scott Brown with the University of Missouri. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Megan.
Let's start first a little bit about this week's livestock markets. What are some of the things that we've seen and how did things fare this week?
Yes, I'll say it was a fairly calm week. Generally, when you look across the board from a price standpoint, whether we talk live fed cattle or feeder cattle or even hogs, by and large, we've been flat across the week, so not a lot of news on the price front. If we look at feed costs, we did get prospective plantings out, and that was pretty hard on corn prices, but we got a recovery there as well this week. Certainly not all the way back to where we were pre-report, but a little higher feed costs coming in. But in general, it's been a fairly quiet week, I will say, in livestock markets.
We talk a lot about the trade issue, exports, and demand for these products. Let's kind of look at the numbers from February for the monthly trade and see what we have there.
Yeah, Megan, we got a report out from USDA midweek that gave us some February monthly data. Oftentimes we're going to talk about the weekly data, and the monthly data comes out a little slower for us. But when we start looking at where we've been, I look at beef here to begin with. Beef exports for January and February of this year relative to 15. Beef exports actually up 1.9%. Now, I'll remind us that when we think back to early 2015, we had some dock issues on the West Coast that I think slowed down exports the first couple of months. So I don't want to get too excited about being up a little less than 2%. Japan was one of the countries where we've seen a 7.2% increase in beef exports so far this year relative to 15. So maybe we've come to the bottom when we think about what's been happening on the export front as the dollar has strengthened substantially the last several months. When you look at the percentage of beef we're exporting, or domestic beef produced that we're exporting, we're sitting here at a little shy of 10%. On the pork side, perhaps a little better news. We're up 6.2% for the first couple of months of this year relative to a year ago. I think we've seen the Chinese potentially get back in the market for some U.S. pork. Japan also up 10% these first couple of months relative to a year ago. I'll always say anytime the Chinese decide they want to get in any of our U.S. meat markets and import some product, it's certainly good news for us. If we look at the percentage of pork production we're exporting, it's sitting there at about 20%. So not a bad percentage, but I look back and it wasn't that many years ago we were at 25%. So still a lot of work to do, especially when we're moving more product domestically in terms of production. We certainly need to increase exports.
Let's talk a little bit about that. You mentioned not a bad number to be at, but we're down from where we have been in recent years. What do we need to do to find a place or a home for all of this product, beef, pork, poultry, all of the meats?
I think we continue to have to look at what's happening on the domestic market side to be helpful to us in 2016. And I think you can find a number of signs that lead us different directions. Last week I think we talked about the Restaurant Performance Index. The February data there actually looked relatively stronger, albeit we had a leap year issue to take care of. When you start looking at some of the consumer sentiment data that's out there, we've now got 4 months in a row where we've been moving lower in terms of overall consumer sentiment about the economy. That begins to make me a little worried about how much extra money we have in folks' pockets in terms of being able to spend on meat products. Unemployment rates, they're much lower than they were a few years ago, although I think we're now finding them much harder to move lower than where we've been recently. I still think it's a very different recovery depending on your level of income. Some of those with the lowest level of income, I think, are the ones that are struggling still the most to get out of what is a pretty tough situation. Putting more money in their pockets certainly ought to help us from a meat demand standpoint. Now, I take beef sometimes and I'll say, putting something in front of consumers that they're really interested in, seems to continue to reap some benefits. I just recently looked at the prime box beef cutout value, and so far this year we've been up about $26 a hundred on that prime beef box beef cutout. We've been up a little bit on choice, a little less than $10 since the start of the year, but it tends to give you some idea of what we're doing in terms of demand for that higher end beef product. It still seems to be relatively strong.
When we talk about this whole consumer demand thing, we look at your weekly grocery store ad, and you're seeing $6.99, $7.99 for really high quality cuts of beef, and you're seeing fairly reasonable prices on pork too. Where's that balance between increase a price point that increases consumer demand, but also doesn't break the bank for the livestock producer as well?
Yeah, well, and so I think all of this volatility, it creates problems on both sides of the equation. I will say all the time that the last thing we want is to run consumer meat prices so high that consumers start to switch or look for those alternatives. And this is where sometimes I'll look at beef in particular being the most expensive. When you put really high prices in front of consumers and all of a sudden they decide some of the other meat products, and I'll say like chicken, might give them a better bargain. If they don't switch back to beef at some point when prices come down, that's worrisome for the beef industry. Now, I will say less volatility, I think, is helpful in terms of continuing to push more products towards consumers. I will say equally as important is making sure that we're putting products in front of consumers that they want today. I think we continue to have to work very hard to make certain that we're putting exactly what today's consumers want in front. And I will say, across the meats, the competition's going to get much stiffer than we've seen for a while. When we are growing per capita meat consumption in this country, that fight for the center of the plate is going to continue, I think, to intensify as we look at 2016 and 2017.
Scott, you bring up consumer demand and a price point. Also, we saw an announcement this week from America's biggest retailer, food retailer, Walmart, saying that they're making a switch within the next 10 years or so to 100% cage-free supply, 100% cage-free eggs in their stores. How does that affect price, availability, and how is the supply chain affected in the industry as well?
Well, so I will say luckily that doesn't happen this year in 2016, and that transition's not until 2025. I think it gives the egg industry a longer period of time to try to make that adjustment towards cage-free production. And oftentimes I say, this is going to come down to what's the cost for that conversion from what's been traditional egg production to more cage-free. I don't think the cost is zero, and we've seen a lot of estimates out there at what kind of cost that conversion is, but ultimately consumers may pay a little more for the cage-free eggs. If the demand for cage-free eggs is as high as it appears, maybe that's a good change for us in the industry moving towards cage-free. But again, I go, at least we have several years here to try to make that transition. An abrupt change right away certainly would short the number of available cage-free eggs to the point that I think we'd run prices much higher. So you have to really run that balancing act of how long does it take the supply side of the egg industry to come in to check with what's going to be demand for cage-free eggs, and that longer period of time may be helpful for us.
How much of a role will consumers or could consumers play in what happens on the farm? If we see this demand for cage-free, but what about housing for other animals or antibiotic use and those type of things? Does this open a gate? Is this a gateway to those issues as well?
Well, I think more and more we see consumers that are interested in learning more about how food generally in this country is being produced. I don't know that it's necessarily good or bad in terms of what's happening. I think we have a lot of education to do of consumers today. The number of folks that have much of a connection to production ag anymore is so limited that for many of them they don't understand from start to finish where their food comes from, and so the idea of wanting to learn more in some ways may be good, it may help us at some point in terms of what are some of the things that we should be changing to provide a product that consumers want more. And again, I'll come back to, eventually if consumers are willing to pay premium prices for particular products, and we can talk organic, we could talk grass-fed, I put them all together. We should embrace what consumers want and be willing to provide that if it puts more money in our pockets at the end of the day. It may be a different production technology than we're used to employing in the industry. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad.
And especially in a time where we're looking at tighter margins and a little bit, maybe pinching pennies a little bit more, finding an opportunity to make a little added revenue isn't horrible on all fronts.
Absolutely. I always go, you have a couple of choices here, and that's try to get some type of premium for your product that's out there, or you have to be one of the least cost producers. And I know farmers quite often don't like to hear that you got to cut costs. That's a pretty tough road to get down. So looking for something that provides premiums is an opportunity for some folks to remain in business.
Scott, you always have a silver lining for us at the end of the week. Anything else?
Well, I do think it's been interesting so far in 2016 as we tend to push more products into the marketplace. That frankly, when you look at things like hog prices, they've been better than I would have maybe imagined that we've been able to hold so far. So let's hope we can continue to see demand strong enough to move the amount of supplies we have coming this year, Megan.
Scott, good to see you. We will talk to you next Friday.
Very good. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. I'm Meghan Grebner for Brownfield.